Martin Amis, born in 1949, was a towering figure in British literature, known as much for his sharp, provocative writing as for his reputation as the bad boy of the literary world. The son of famed novelist Kingsley Amis, Martin grew up in a world of intellectuals and writers, but he quickly established himself as a rebellious, edgy voice in his own right. He came of age in the postwar era, a time of social upheaval, cultural revolutions, and the decline of the British Empire. This backdrop, coupled with the permissiveness of the 1960s and the excesses of the 1980s, deeply influenced his work. Amis's writing, often characterized by its dark humor, biting satire, and moral ambivalence, reflected the chaos of the times. Whether skewering the greed of Thatcherite Britain or exploring the existential dread of the nuclear age, he earned a reputation as a literary enfant, terrible, unafraid to shock, offend, or criticize the establishment. His tumultuous relationship with his father, Kingsley, a giant of British post-war fiction, also loomed large over his career. While Martin rebelled against the older generation's more traditional forms of writing, his own style was shaped by a desire to break away from, yet inevitably grapple with, his father's legacy. Amis's novels, such as Money and London Fields, encapsulated the spirit of the times, morally ambiguous, disillusioned, and obsessed with excess. His personal life mirrored the hedonism and unpredictability of his fiction, adding to his bad boy persona. Yet beneath the scandal and controversy lay a serious, often profound examination of the human condition, making Martin Amis one of the most influential and controversial writers of his generation.
The Rachel Papers by Martin Amis is about a young man in London cramming hard to get into Oxford to read English literature and learning fast about life in the metropolis. Sex and scholarship seem to be the two drives in this book, but what did you find were the dangers of writing about adolescence?
Well, the first one perhaps was just the same as any first novelist feels, the fear of being no good, having any talent, can't make it come alive. The second one, intensified by that perhaps, was the danger of making it boring in the way adolescence is boring, hysterical, winsome, grotesque, a sort of pimply rant. So I found I had to detach myself, although I was very near to adolescence. I wrote the book when I was 22. I had to get some sort of perspective on it to make it interesting to non-adolescents.
Another almost a convention of novels about adolescence is that they should have a go at what you call the oldsters at some stage or other about something or other. What particularly do you think you were having a go at?
Well, the narrator is physically very self-conscious and actually treats his body as someone of 60 might worry about their bodies. So naturally, the world of the oldsters is sort of grand guignol, decay and horror. And that's just to indulge the adolescent disgust that is apparently very prevalent at the moment.
What depressed me in a way, and what I wanted to ask you was, why the hostility towards women in it? It really made me feel a bit creepy sometimes.
Well, it was about a special sort of adolescence, at the point where sex has become fundamentally unmysterious. I tried to exaggerate this. I mean, I wouldn't like you to think I felt that way about women.
That's really what I wanted to know.
No, not at all. No, I'm much more gallantry than my hero. But he, as Melvin said, it's about sex and scholarship in a jokey way. And he's scholarly about sex and sexual about scholarship. He's read up on sex. I thought this was just the only way to make it funny, to make actually carnal rather than erotic sex funny, rather than boring or disgusting or whatever.
Today, I made a break with habit and tradition, took my lunch at the Newborn restaurant. The Newborn's a hot little grotto of plastic panels and formica tabletops. Half cheap bistro, half Yob's beanery, run by an elite squad of Italians together with some straggly irregulars. You get all sorts in here, from dustmen to middle management. The menu is chip-orientated, but the place is licensed. Well, how else could it seriously expect my customers? I was sitting there waiting for the grub to show when Martin Amis came through the open door. You know, the writer I was chatting to in the pub the other night. The place was pretty full, and he hesitated until he saw the empty bench at my table. I don't think he saw me. Then Martin sat down opposite and quickly flattened a book out in front of him. This kid's going to ruin his eyes. Fate. He looked up with a flash of panic. He recognised me. People usually do. It's one of the kickbacks you get for looking like I look.
I, in common with many writers, I think, feel that there is a, and this may be again just something that every writer feels in every generation, that there's a great convulsion of stupidity happening in the world, mostly to do with television. People know a little about a lot and put very little effort into accumulating knowledge and culture. And when they do, it's almost like a sort of consumerism of culture. If this is happening, then perhaps what I'm trying to do in that book is to write as interestingly and as you say, with as much literary effect as possible, about a landscape in which there is no literature or culture. He comes across it, he encounters culture in various forms, in art galleries and opera houses. And when he meets me, I'm a minor character in the book sent to perplex and bedevil him even more. But he can't make known sense of it. He has nothing to fall back on to interpret it.
But he doesn't have to. You see, I actually suspect you of a much more 20th century view than the one you're putting to me now.
Well, I think this is a sort of a new 20th century view.
But you're talking to me like Martin Amis, the character in the book, who's rather prissy, really.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And I would have said that in the Martin Amis that I know slightly, there's a good slice of John's self.
You want a drop of this?
No, thanks. I try not to drink at lunchtime.
Yeah, so do I. I never quite make it.
I feel like shit all day if I drink at lunchtime.
Me too. I feel like shit all lunchtime if I don't.
Yeah, well, it all comes down to choices, doesn't it? It's the same in the evening. Do you want to feel good in the evening, or do you want to feel good in the morning? It's the same with life. Do you want to feel good old, or do you want to feel good young? One or the other, not both.
But then that brings us to the crux of the thing, because the book is, in fact, about money.
Money is, in shorthand, money is the opposite of culture. If you haven't, money is the first value that gets to you, unless you've got culture to stave it off.
One of the strongest impressions of the author in this book is of his ecstatic disgust, especially with the sort of things like the street culture, 42nd Street of New York. Would you say you suffer from disgust?
With regard to disgust, I think every writer, even the blackest writer, actually loves it all.
And you walk towards it rather than turning away?
I'm fascinated in distortions and distempers. I suppose it is temperamental, but I don't sit around feeling disgusted at all. I feel enthused.
I'm really interested in your indignation, because it strikes me no one could write the way you do. You're a really brilliant hater, with an eye for what is horrible, what is grotesque. That indignation is profoundly moral. It involves a sort of rejection of 20th centuryness and the areas of waste and fatigue.
All writers think the world has reached its nadir, its low point. And in fact, this age will be lamented just like the last. That's the paradox. What you can say about the world is that while it may not be getting any better, it's getting infinitely less innocent all the time. It's like, it's been to so many parties, it's been on so many dates, had so many fights, got its handbag stolen so many times. So the accumulation is what makes the world seem at its worst always. Because it's never been through as much as it's been through today, the Earth.
This is a true story, but I can't believe it's really happening. It's a murder story, too. I can't believe my luck. And a love story, I think, of all strange things, so late in the century, so late in a goddamn day. This is the story of a murder, It hasn't happened yet, but it will. It had better. I know the murderer. I know the murderee. I know the time. I know the place. I know the motive, her motive, and I know the means. I know who will be the foil, the fool, the poor fool, also utterly destroyed. And I couldn't stop them, I don't think, even if I wanted to. The girl will die. It's what she's always wanted. You can't stop people once they start. You can't stop people once they start. You can't stop people once they start creating. What a gift! This page is briefly stained by my tears of gratitude. Aspiring novelists don't usually have it so good, do they? When something real happens, something unified, dramatic, and pretty saleable, and they just write it down.
Hello, tonight Martin Amis and his latest novel, London Fields. Martin, son of Kingsley Amis, published his first novel, The Rachel Papers, to some acclaim when he was 24. From the start, he's been seen as a provocative writer, creating a grotesque world in which violence, pornography, and black humour combine with a streetwise lyricism. He himself has described it as the humour of neurosis. Now, at 40, he's the author of 6 novels, a book of stories, and a collection of his occasional journalism. His last novel, Money, won high praise for its manic social observation and hilarious commentary on the decay of the late 20th century. Since that book, Amis has shown his growing preoccupation with the nuclear threat and our potential self-destruction. First in his stories, Einstein's Monsters, and now in the apocalyptic background to his latest novel, London Fields. The location is familiar Amis territory, Notting Hill, West London, an area he's transformed into his own world of seedy streets, low life and urban paranoia. The cast of characters is also peculiar to Amis, who uses caricatures and stereotypes to work and rework the images and obsessions of his imaginative world. You've stayed in West London almost entirely. We went to New York for money and so on. And this is very much Notting Hill Gate, where we are now. The street life is, I presume, taken from the street life around here. What do you find so compelling about it?
It's where I live. I mean, the trouble is, I think I've got to move now. Because I did Queensway, for a couple of books.
3 streets along.
Yeah, and then I moved a mile the other way, and now it's Portobello Road and Laverick Grove and the West Indian elements and that kind of thing. But perhaps it better be Wiltshire now, or the East End. I mean, you do run out of place, I think.
Do you have any sense that when you're writing about low life, you've got to, as it were, get it right from an observational point of view?
I sometimes say to myself, it's really getting bad because the low life that I'm supposedly immersed in, low life is now something I just drive through in my German car. I look out the window and see it. Whereas in the 60s and early 70s, I had been hanging around because of betting shops and getting chucked out of cars. Youth clubs. We are mincing up and down the King's Road. Now, the idea of research, suddenly you think I'd better go and spend some time in a police station or prison or something. But you start anyway, think I'll do that later, and then you find in the end that you've made it all up. It's true when I go to places like South Kensington, I find it creepy. Where's the rubbish? Where's the rabid pigeon? Just like the selection of your material, where your eyes go in the street is predetermined, really. Although I do go out looking for, if I do walk Portobello Road, I hope to find one detail that I haven't noticed before. But I'm not really in search of the sordid. It is sordid. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that approximately 1 in 3 of the city's indigenous population is quite mad. Obviously, openly, candidly, brazenly mad. Their lives are entirely given over to a bitter commentary on the world, the light, the time of day it is. In every busload, there will be 6 or 7 people who just sit there growling about nothing with tears in their eyes. Every cafe contains, at all times, a working minimum of 2 gesticulating maniacs who have to be shown or chucked out into the street, where they will hover and shout and threaten until someone redoubles their efforts to make them go away again. On every street you walk along, you find the same proportion of people who do nothing but fizz all the hours there are. Fizz with hatred or disappointment or grief, or fizz simply because they are ugly and poor and mad. They ought to get together. They ought to organize. They would form a very powerful lobby. They ought to organize.
You describe London Fields as a murder story, could equally be described as a murderee story. What appeals to you about that?
I don't know, it was some little news item that probably I'd read 5 years before I started the novel, which just had some review of the book, but it said there is this theory that people who are murdered are not genetically, but as it were, disposed towards being murdered. And I thought that was interesting. But so in my novel, I do have this girl who arranges her own murder right down to the, it has to happen at a certain moment in her life. And it's arranged as an artist would arrange it, in that people have to be whipped up into a certain state so that the emotion is high enough for it to take place.
In his latest work, The Information, Amis depicts the vicious envy and incorrigible ego of the literary world that has recently made him the subject of its scrutiny. I'm very pleased to have the author of The Information join us this evening for a conversation about this and about some of the controversy that swirls around his writing of it and how much he got paid. Welcome. All right. Tell me about this. I mean, it is, the book is about envy. One writer's envy for another. One writer who thinks he writes well about another writer who he thinks writes commercially. But tell me about the envy you have experienced because you got the amount of money you did as an advance for this novel.
Well, envy and jealousy never appear in that form. They appear as aggression, hostility, scurrility, etc. So I've just been through the ringer of the British press, and it's not for me to say that it's all inspired by envy, but it seems that envy played a part. But it's not a simple matter, and it's by now for me a very wearying matter. But the amount of money involved won't strike Americans as particularly, formidable.
For someone who is ranked as one of the best novelists in his country.
Sure, but if I wrote junk, no one would mind me getting a lot of money.
Of course not.
The paradox is,
and in fact, people who write junk get a lot more money than you.
A lot more money than that. No, it turns out, and I'm grateful to have learnt this from the British press, that there's only one activity that you're not allowed to get well paid for. Anything else is fine, but writing serious fiction, it turns out, is something you shouldn't get paid a lot of money for.
Are you surprised?
Well, I'm sort of intrigued by that. But the thing is, it can't be explained as straightforward envy, or it's a British phenomenon. In fact, I could spend an hour talking to you about it, and you still wouldn't be, it couldn't be satisfactorily explained to you how all this hostility has blossomed about this book. Because you need to be English to understand a particular network of, anti-Americanism is one theme of it, because I'm identified with America and England. The idea that I'm a writer's son, and therefore it was just like, taking over the family pub. It was no work for me to become a novelist. All kinds of resentments that, it would take a computer to log, flowered up around this book.
Let me go through it quickly and then get to the book itself. As to what's happened to you. You demanded, or your agent did, £500,000. You got it. In the process, or thereabouts, in the process, you changed agents. You were going through a midlife crisis, which I'd like to hear more about. Mm-hmm. You left your wife.
No, well, that was all that had all happened. That aspect of the midlife crisis was over by the time
this deal happened. But it was true that it could be identified as another, series of sunderings and changes of course.
Yeah. Tell me about the midlife crisis.
Well, I think this book is about a midlife crisis,
Right.
and it almost performs a midlife crisis itself. It even has a midlife crisis, this book.
Well, there's
But
amazing art. I mean, this is about envy. You've experienced envy. This is about a midlife crisis. You've experienced a midlife crisis. It's about, some say, rivalry between friends. You've experienced that.
Yeah. No, a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies and postmodern ironies
Yes.
come together in this book. But I think the midlife crisis, I used to think before I had one that midlife crisis was just a thing that happened to weak-minded chumps who didn't have the bottom and the backbone to, get by without a midlife crisis. Now I believe that actually midlife crises are structural. They're to do with your whole life. They're intrinsic. They're to do with facing things that haven't been faced. What gets them going, the midlife crisis, is an hysterical overreaction to the certainty, the certain knowledge that you're going to die. And I think one of the definitions of youth is that you think death and decay is something that happens to other people, but you think, one part of you thinks, funnily enough, in my case, it's not going to happen. Although you're intellectually persuaded that it will, a bit of you goes on saying, well, it's just a rumor as far as I'm concerned. But around about 40, the jig is up, and you have to join in with the great communality of those who are going to die.
And you know.
And and you react. Some people's midlife crisis can be solved by going out and getting a little sports car, and then you come roaring out of your midlife crisis at its wheel. Others, take longer and, are longer and messier to resolve.
And you?
Well, my life has changed in lots of ways, but whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I do feel that it's kind of been and gone now.
And when you felt it, it seems to me from reading the book and reading about you, is that you wanted, beyond questions about mortality and the sureness that you were halfway there, say.
More than halfway.
More than halfway, depending on your genes and other factors. That you wanted to know, where do I stand and how much am I worth and how do they measure where I've come?
Yeah, that's true. It wasn't the money. It was more to do with thinking, I'm never going to be 45 again. I perhaps will not write another long novel. I am supposed to be one of the leading writers of my generation. And you say, well, what does this entail?
So what's the problem, Martin, is what I say.
Yeah. Well, also, let's have a look at the figures and see, And having been very incurious about money and earnings and so on, I didn't open a bank statement for 15 years because I knew that if I was in money trouble, someone would tell me.
Yes.
I had no intrinsic interest in money. But then I suddenly just thought, well, let's find this out. And it was a desire that you can set within the midlife thing, in that you just want to know where you stand and what have you got.
Well, let's see if they really need to worry. I'm joined now by Martin Amis, who's about to take up a post of Professor of Creative Writing, and his fellow novelist, John Banville. Let's talk first about the state of the novel. It's in pretty good health, isn't it? I mean, you look at the number of novels published and read.
Yeah, it's in rude health and always has been for the last 400 years or so. People keep pronouncing its, imminent death, but I think it answers a basic need. I think the novel gives the reader, now bear with me, a communion with their inner selves that they first got when they were adolescents, and when you become self-aware and you start writing poems and writing diaries and notes, and you suddenly realize there is someone inside that you commune with. I think the experience of reading a novel exactly reproduces that feeling with such strength, with such intimacy, that no computerized version of this or online version is ever going to replace that intimate interaction with the self.
And there have been numerous predictions over the last 20 or 30 years about the imminent death of the novel, haven't there?
Yes, well, I mean, the novel is an odd form. It's the youngest art form, and it seems to have been used up very quickly indeed. But we keep finding new ways of going forward. You know, the fiction is of House of Many Mansions. There are all kinds of ways of doing novels. Martin and I suppose we admire each other's work, but we work very differently. We write very different kinds of novels.
Are there certain sorts of novels that can no longer be written or sold in the current environment?
Well, I was amazed to read two great novels of the 60s and 70s, both by Saul Bellow, the Nobel Prize-winning American novelist. Massive books, Herzog and Humboldt's Gift, that spent months on the bestseller lists in America and here. And I had to say that they're magnificent creations, but they couldn't survive with the modern reader, because the reader changes as the writer does. We're all evolving on parallel tracks. But these novels are so indifferent to momentum. And I think that one of the great adaptations the novel has made in the last 10, 15 years is realizing that history is speeded up, therefore the novel must speed up. And this is why poetry is perhaps marginalized now, because what a poem does is stop the clock. And we were very happy to have the clock stop for us half a generation ago, but now it rubs us up the wrong way. It's a strain to have the clock stop.
Do you feel that pressure too?
Oh yes, I mean, we live in an age of the personality. It used to be that the work itself was what counted. Now it's the person who did it and how many divorces you have.
This need to have a certain kind of narrative drive, the constant press of events, the need for repeated development throughout.
Yes, I don't do that. I write differently. I try to make a kind of, I risk saying it, a kind of poetic fiction that demands a deeper reading than you would for the novel that you would pick up in an airport.
Tell you what, if you were taking up Martin's job tomorrow, we can ask him the question in a minute, what would you say were the writers you had to read if you wished yourself to be a significant creative writer?
Oh, I mean, where would one start? I would certainly...
Wherever you like.
Well, I'm Irish, so I would say read Joyce's Dubliners, which seems to me a handbook of how to do it if you're starting out. Do it cleanly, do it clearly, do it honestly.
Well, I would... I think, you know, reading is the other half of writing, or the other third, because living has to get its end in somehow. But you can't be a writer unless you're a reader. That's pretense. And therefore you're committed to the canon, because the canon is the body of work where time has had a chance. Judge time, the only reviewer with any real authority, has had a chance to separate the excellent from the less excellent. But I'm going to take the reader forward into the 19th century and then the 20th century. I think although it's a truism that the novel doesn't improve, it just evolves and provides the model, we recognize those voices in a way that we wouldn't recognize the voices of the 18th century and earlier.
But given that you can write, why do you want to teach it?
Well, I can do both. It's not going to, I don't think it's not going to, it's fractionally going to diminish what I can turn out myself. It'll also give me an excuse and the necessity of reading great books. Where you think, thank God I now have to read these, which I wouldn't normally do.
You do think it can be taught, do you?
Talent can't be taught. It can be. There is only one school of writing, that of talent, as Nabokov said. And talent obviously can't be taught. It can be brought on, it can be brought out, it can be developed. And I think, you know, craft can be taught, and there will be a meeting point between craft and talent, is what I'm hoping for.
Would you do the job?
No, I think I would tell them all to give it up now before it's too late, before they start. It's too hard a life. But certainly what Martin says is true. You can lead people on. You can lead people on to reading. And certainly reading is half of writing. You know, 50% of what you do is reading. This is how we learn.
John Banville, Martin Amis, thank you both very much.
In a recent review of the last book by the American writer John Updike, and then again in a debate at Manchester University, you suggested novelists almost invariably get worse as they get older, and the later books can be embarrassing. It's quite a risky gambit for a novelist of 60 with a new book out. Did it reflect any nervousness about your own curve?
It's on my mind a lot because it's a sort of recent negative eureka on my part. I found it and I don't want it, which is coming to realize that it does seem to be this almost invariable downward curve. It's a modern phenomenon. Dickens died at 59, Shakespeare 54, Jane Austen at 41. There was no question in the past of the talent dying before the body, but we can see it in certain examples of writers who did hang on for a bit, like Tolstoy. The early novella, The Death of Ivan Illich, is immortal. The late novella, The Kreutzer Sonata, is dreadful on every level. I'm going to be haunted by it, I'm sure, and I wish I wasn't so self-aware about it. But for the time being, I've just finished a long novel. I've almost completed another novel, and I know exactly what the novel after that's going to be. So after a great struggle with this book, I'm in remission.
You refer to this in your memoir, Experience, and you've become part of this small repertory company. Probably Salman Rushdie is the only other novelist, and for other reasons, who newspapers just write about. They think our readers will know who these people are, they'll want to know. In your case, it was partly, perhaps even largely, because of being the son of a famous novelist, Kingsley Amis.
That's, I'm sure that's it. And it's been a strange ride, really, from the 70s to now, in that when you start out, everyone is almost embarrassingly generous. In that climate, anyway. I'm not sure how it would go down now, but and everyone's saying, oh, it must have been very difficult, and in fact, it wasn't. It slightly eased things, being the son of. But later on, it changed. Now, I don't think I should be penalized for being the son of Kingsley Amis, because I didn't have any say in it. But I think that's what happens, and thus I became the English novelist about whom you can say anything you like. On the other hand, I can think of no other examples in literature of a father, a parent and a child producing bodies of work that are about the same weight, roughly. In most cases, sort of David Updike and others, they write one novel or one book of stories, and that seems to satisfy whatever it was that made them want to write, a certain emulousness, rivalrousness with the parent. It was nothing to do with my father, my starting to write. It was always, I always knew I was in it for the long haul, that this would be my life. So maybe, if there is a privilege, it's that I've never taken what's said about me too seriously, because writing isn't a sort of magical profession for me, as it must be to, I'm thinking of my friends, son of a businessman, son of a school teacher, son of an army man. To find yourself a writer must be extraordinary. But to me, it never was extraordinary, because nothing is more banal than what your father does.
I was also very struck, looking back, to an extent that I hadn't realised before, that if we look at your 14 work of fiction so far, from Rachel Papers 1973 to Pregnant Widow 2010, there is a recurrent structure. In a large number of them, there is a man in pursuit of a woman. It's true of Money, it's true of London Fields, and he will probably be humiliated in the course of this quest.
Yes, I taught Philip Roth's first novella, Goodbye Columbus. If you remember, it was filmed in a quite memorable scene of the girl saying at the swimming pool, "Will you hold my sunglasses?" Then he goes straight home and calls her up. And I said to my class, I said, "That's pretty flash, isn't it?" I said, "That's the difference between an American novel and a British novel. A British novel, the first 40 pages would have been about him plucking up the courage to give her a call." We are, as a nation, sort of uniquely diffident. If you look at the small ads in an American journal, you'll say, you know, handsome, slim, non-smoker wants to meet, you know. In the British equivalent is chain-smoking, alcoholic, out of work, you know, overweight, chap, age 50, wants. We are a diffident nation in these matters, and I reflect that, I helplessly reflect that. I think we're full of nerves and scruples about interactions between the sexes. So there is a great weight of tradition that will tend to humiliate the male.
Your father was very interested in populist genres, but he would declare it. He would write a crime novel or a science fiction novel. I hadn't realized the extent to which you have used those genres. So Time's Arrow, we have an element of science fiction in that it goes backwards. London Fields, in which a woman colludes in her own death, is a kind of murder novel. So you have taken on those generic structures, but without being as open about it.
Without actually being much interested in the form. I used to be interested in science fiction, but the novel Night Train, for instance, is a sort of policier, a noir policier, but I can't have read more than half dozen of those in my life. Kingsley, you know, the truth is that Kingsley regarded the novel as actually a form very junior to the poem, and thought that its role was mainly that of entertainment.
Well, he once said Dick Francis was the greatest living English novelist, didn't he?
Yeah, and also he said to me proudly one day, quite late on, he said, I decided I'm never going to read another novel that doesn't begin with the sentence, "A shot rang out." And that's what he liked to read. And when people say, weren't you upset that he didn't read your fiction? I'd say he doesn't read any fiction. He reads thrillers. You know, if you asked him who his favorite novelist was, he'd say Anthony Poe, and then he'd be really rather stuck to come up with anyone. Didn't like Dickens, you know, didn't like Nabokov, didn't like Saul Bellow, didn't like all the people I like. So it was not that wounding when he sort of turned out not to read me. He read Time's Arrow in a day, and was very nice about it, but I'm sure that was because it did have an element of science fiction, and that it was a kind of puzzle and an inversion of reality of the kind he liked. But even the novel dedicated to him, London Fields, he despite my mother, who was by then his housekeeper in old age, standing over him with a knife, he didn't get beyond about page 20.
I thought we would begin with the title of your new novel. It's such a powerful, evocative phrase. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Well, it has sort of three levels. The zone of interest was what the Nazis called the Greater Auschwitz area. And as we'll no doubt will have more to say about this, that interest is there not because it's interesting, but because it makes money. The cupidity and rapacity of the Nazis in this project, the Holocaust, is beyond belief and compounds the crime. It also refers to the zone of interest is, in his view, is what someone really is. And if you read the testimonies of the survivors, it's something that comes up again and again, that no one knows themselves, and until they're in an extreme situation. You know, in normal, peaceful, civilized life, you only are aware of about 10% of your resources and your deeper personality. But in an atrocity-producing context, you find out amazing things about yourself, both the perpetrators and the victims. And the other thing is that the zone of interest is how I feel about the whole subject, in that W.G. Sebald said that no serious person ever thinks about anything else. And it was meant to be an ironic aside, but I think there's a level on which he meant it. And there's a level on which I mean it too, that it is not just the magnitude of the crime, but the inexplicability of the crime, and of Hitler, and of the German people. No historian claims to understand Hitler, and most of them make a point of saying that they don't. And some, like Alan Bullock, say that the more he learns about Hitler, the harder he finds it to understand. And Ron Rosenbaum wrote a terrific book called Explaining Hitler that doesn't, I mean, there is no explanation, nor will there be. And he has a chapter where he imagines possible revelations that, you know, could explain it, and actually none of them do. None of them could. So I can't imagine ever losing my horrified fascination regarding this subject.
Martin Amis has been called many things, among them misogynist, Islamophobe, a snob. He calls himself a comic novelist. He's the author of 14 novels, 2 collections of stories, 6 nonfiction books, and a memoir. And now he's got a new collection called The Rub of Time, Bellow, Nabokov, Hitchens, Travolta, Trump, Essays, and Reportage, 1994 to 2017. And it is a pleasure to welcome him to our studio tonight. Welcome.
Thank you.
Do you think that you're misunderstood? I just named off a few things that people have called you, but do you think you're misunderstood?
Yeah, I think it's settling down. I mean, the rubbish about misogyny, it's very cheap shot, that. I mean, what can you say? But I regard myself not only as a feminist, but as a gynocrat. I look forward to a utopia where women are in charge.
How do you think that would change things?
Well, I mean, I don't think it would be very difficult to do better than men. I mean, look at human history, it's a mess. That old historian's convention of referring to women, to countries as female, you know, France thought it was in her best interest to, etc. That was never more than a sort of false gallantry. Countries behave like men and could do very urgently with the injection of some female qualities. What happens is that when a woman is running for power, she thinks she has to be more as masculine as a man, and I want them to concentrate on their female qualities. And I think Angela Merkel is the nearest we've come to that. Mm-hmm. She's not like Margaret Thatcher. Everyone thought Margaret Thatcher was a man who kept going into the wrong toilet. She and Hillary Clinton was saying how she was going to wipe Iran off the map if they did this. That kind of aggressive talk we've tried that, you know.
But do you think maybe it's just responding to what people expect women to be, if you're in power, to be taken seriously? That's
the thinking. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there have been about 50 women head of states, and maybe a third of those got to be head of states through marriage or through heredity. I want a woman to be elected on the merits, and these should be feminine merits. And we all know the major difference between men and women, which is violence, reliance on force. And that has not produced a shining record in history. So the new approach.
Do you think like the charge of misogynist is from some of the work that you've written in the past?
I do blush a bit when I look at my very early novels, but the one that is often taken as an example of misogyny is in fact programmatically feminist novel. That's the novel called Money, my 5th novel. And since then, I think I've been, and it's not, I spent a day with Gloria Steinem in the early 80s, and I read her piece, What If Men Menstruated? And it completely converted me. And she says, among other things, that if men menstruated, they would boast about how much and how often.
And how painful maybe it is.
Yeah, and she said street guys would high five and say, "Hey man, you're looking good." "Yeah man, I'm on the rag." It would be a macho thing. And she said, and if that were the case, abortion would be a sacrament, she said. It would flip everything.
Over the course of your career, you've been asked to name what your favorite book is. And you've said that you can't do that because it's like naming your favorite child. But having to go through your essays and your repertoire to have this collection, how did you choose what essays to include?
I basically put them all in. No, I pruned it a bit. You know, it's not much fun writing an essay. Reportage is easy because you're given a narrative. But a literary essay, a long literary essay, is the hardest thing I do.
But you do it over and over again. Why?
I always think, oh, you've done it again. You've agreed to do it again. I do it because work ethic. There was Protestant work ethic. There was absolutely not a whisper of Protestantism in my childhood house. In fact, when I had to fill in a form at school, at home for school, and it said age, etc., and it said religion. And I went out into the passage and shouted up the stairs, "Mom, what religion are we?" And there was a really long silence. And then she said, in a burst, she said, "Church of England," which of course is hardly a religion at all. The question of God never came up, but the work ethic was just in the air.
And you're quite funny. Are you able to sneak that more in the essays as opposed to the reportage?
Well, you know, if you think about it, as Saul Bellow, in one of the last things he wrote, saying it's the case that almost all of the novels, the great novels, the good novels, are written by humorists. Nabokov said that anyone who's any good is going to be funny. And there must be a reason for that, and the reason is that life itself is funny. I mean, not the big events, not the wars and the volcanoes and earthquakes, but our daily dealings are somehow comic. They sometimes say of politicians, well, of course he's a bit humorless, but that's a really grave accusation. It means you have no common sense either.
But you've posed that accusation to Jeremy Corbyn and I think Donald Trump.
Yeah. Clive James said a brilliant thing about humor. He said, humor is just common sense moving at a different speed. It's just common sense dancing. That's all humor is.
And what is the title of the book alluding to, The Rub of Time?
Well, it has two main applications. One is that time is the value judgment in literature, in lit crit, is the sort of holy grail that people have been, you know, how do you prove that one piece of writing is better than an obviously less good piece of writing? And the answer is you can't prove it. It's a fool's errand, that. All you can do is labor the point and impose your own taste. But there is judge time is the only force that delivers real value judgments. If a novel has survived for a century and is still read, that's a very strong indication of its quality. And Jane Austen is an excellent example
a writer who renews herself for every generation.
Do you think about that, about whether your work will stand the test of time?
Yeah, in a sort of sneaky way. It's ironic because, and humorous again, in that when you die, when a novelist dies, you'd think there'd be an upsurge of interest in that writer, but in fact, they go dormant for about 5 years.
It's not like pop stars, huh?
Yeah, and my Spanish publisher said, when you die, you have to go to purgatory and burn off your sins. And then, with luck, and you can time it, the interest reappears. And the result being that you never do find out if you're any good when you're alive. Only your ghost is ever going to know whether you're any good. And that keeps you honest in some way.